So we're starting to get into the idea of risk management. So how do we manage these risks? How do we look at that probability that risks are going to occur? So if we think about it in the abstract, is there a possibility a hurricane can impact Peru State College? So the risk, the percentage is very, 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 very minor. On the other hand, can high winds damage equipment in the campus? And is that a pretty high likelihood here on our college campus? Twice a year we lose power, something happens, the roof tends to be going down the street in the 70-mile-an-hour winds. So we look at that in terms of what our probabilities are on how we structure outcomes based on that. So the reality is, to do any of this assessment, we need to know both ourselves, and we use the term enemy, but in many cases, it's other organizations, outside entities. How well do we know them? How does our information get transmitted from one spot to the other? And so when I say enemy, I may not be referring necessarily to something we normally think of an enemy, but anything that is a weakness to our information security. So the fact that our internet here at our campus is actually going through UNL, being a much larger university, could we consider them the enemy in this regard in terms of risk management? Yes. Now, certainly we're not going to ever be enemies on a football field, hopefully. Alex looks a little, oh, that would be brutal from all, but the reality is, I've seen you guys play Haskell at university, so, you guys have played Haskell. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not in the last couple of years. Yeah, it was a team that played every year. Yeah, yeah. They were, yes. They were different. So we have to look at our weaknesses. What weaknesses do we have? How do we move information around? What resources do we have? Do we have finite cash resources to buy equipment, supplies, whatever it takes, hire outside consultants? And the reality is, no company does. What resources are available? How is our information stored? And sometimes we have to think about that in terms of what we don't realize where our information gets moved to, how it gets sorted, how it gets stored, what happens with it, and is it just electronic information that could be an issue? What about paper records stored inside of a cabinet? And that's our backup. What happens if that building burns down? What about those risks? Many, many, many years ago when I was working as a surveyor, I got to work in a county that the courthouse burned down. And not all of those records in terms of property documents, deeds, were all stored, a copy of them off-site. And it was 25 years after the fact, and it was still an issue trying to identify properties. And so people living there were greatly impacted. When you tried to sell a house, you couldn't get title insurance, which meant a lot of banks wouldn't loan money on a house. So we really need to look at what are our assets, what is valuable to us. So here at Peru State College, what is valuable to us in terms of student records? What's valuable to us in terms of human resource records? And what's not very valuable? When do you have a cutoff date? Do student records ever expire? Do we have students that have come back after 20, 30, 40 years or longer? There was a student here in the early 80s when I began teaching at Fort Hays State. There was a student who graduated at age 97, I think. And if you look at that time frame of those records, they may have started 60 or 70 years ago. And in fact, we keep student records for perpetuity. On the other hand, human resource records, how long do we need to keep those? Maybe those are different. Records about what trees are on campus or these kinds of things may be less valuable. So we can assign priorities to what information, what resources, what things are important to us. So when I talk about the enemy, again, we're talking about others who can impact the security of our data and those things we hold valuable. So we may not think of them necessarily always in terms of the enemy, in terms of a combative situation, but there's somebody who can have an impact or can have some kind of a risk to us. So we think of UNL as an ally for the most part, but when you talk in terms of risk management, the fact that our internet content gets processed through there, they become an enemy. Blackboard, we use their services to host this class and others. We think of them then as an enemy also because we store our information there. What happens if Blackboard goes down, which it apparently does on? It does, and they have to utilize maintenance. What happens if their data center, which is by Washington, D.C., is it affected by a hurricane? Yes, it can be. It's actually been shut down and they moved to a remote site before. So we look at that idea of risk analysis. So every person and piece in this group. So IT, how do we build a secure system? Management, how do we get people trained and aware of what's going on? What kind of threats are out there? Training users. And so one of the things that came out of Cyber Siege, there's a lot of things in training of your users. How do I train users not to open up every email? And most of us in this class already, you're thinking, well, I get this strange email, I'm not going to open it. And yet, every day, some company goes around and their email gets compromised because they've gotten hit with something on an email. So how do we train? How does our IT put in the best things we can do? How does InfoSec, that person, takes that leadership role and looks at it as a macro viewpoint? So in other words, they're looking at the overall picture, not just the individual subsections. So we look at that idea of cost. What kind of controls do we need? What kind of risks? And are we ever going to be 100% accurate in assessing risks in the future? And we're not. So this risk management becomes an ongoing process as things change. So today I read an article, and one of the things I've talked about in here in terms of physical security are things like cameras, right? And you can go buy now, Home Depot has got 8 camera systems for $500 or less. You can put those in your house, connect them to your internet. You can watch what's going on in your house via your cell phone. Today, though, I found that a researcher was investigating some anomalous behavior in these DVRs. And those recorders that record that really are a small computer. They're usually based on an ARM chip. They are now finding malware that's going out and scanning for those DVRs and installing itself on there and doing a couple of things. One variation of it is actually being used as a distributed resource to mine bitcoins. And the other version is out there just trying to attack other systems and find open spots. So it could open identify and find locations it can utilize. And those are in those DVRs you buy. Plug in and we think they're safe, and now all of a sudden we go, oh no, that's not safe. And so that's a change, and we need to deal with that. So there's a process all the way from planning and organizing the process itself to identifying threats, vulnerability assets, what is that relative risk for these particular things. And so we'll look at some methodology for calculating risk and probability, and you've probably seen it in POM and some other quantitative classes. So risk identification, kind of think, if you want to, like a brainstorming session. We identify those resources, so you'll get all your managers and some of your key staff to look at what's important. If we know what's important, then we can know what's going to be targeted. And sometimes those things change depending on our company. We may want to create an inventory of resources. So information assets, so people, how we do things, procedures, that data itself, hardware, software, what pieces are in our network. So switches, routers, hubs, all of those things could be all compromised How do we deal with them and make sure that we're all documenting those? So here's kind of a matrix that you can look at. So people you might break down into internal and external. So you might have trusted employees all the way down to strangers. If we look at networking, all the way from local networks, internet components, all the way to cloud-based systems. And cloud-based systems are scary for a lot of companies. And they're scary sometimes when we think of them in terms of security. How do we know where that data is stored? How do we know it's stored securely? How do we know it's not being used without our knowledge? And so how do we verify that? So one of the things that's kind of interesting is this process forces us to start looking at hardware, software, networking pieces, and look at some kind of an asset inventory system. So there are some tools out there, and I've mentioned in other classes, and you'll hear me mention it in networking and some others, tools like Spiceworks. Here at Purdue, we use Case. We use these online asset tools. So every computer that logs into the network, we can pull up things like, so if they're a Dell system, we can pull up their IDs, their serial numbers, and those kinds of things. It's not 100%, and we still have to have a manual asset for a lot of things, but those things that are on the network, we can usually identify pretty quickly. So if you don't already have an inventory system, you would be amazed how many companies have thousands of employees, hundreds and hundreds of computers and network, and they don't have a clue what assets they really have. So what kind of attributes do we want to have? So in a lot of cases, we use something like an asset tag. So if you look around at Purdue State, a lot of the equipment has a Purdue State College identifier sticker on it. So I was talking briefly about the printers, and if you look at that sticker, from that printer, each one of them has a unique barcode and serial number, so that Capital can track our printers. Maybe we look at what that MAC address, so if it's a network-controlled device, we look at the MAC address. Maybe we'll look at what type of equipment it is, or software, a serial number, when we got it. And so some of these tools can also be used for management of processes. So maybe we want to move to a model where we update computers every 3 years. Well, if we don't know what computers we have, how are we going to be in the model and even know how to budget for a 3-year cycle of computers? And in a lot of cases, we look at who controls that entity. So if I'm in a hospital, there's a lot of things that may be connected to the network, and yet we may hire a third party who's certified by some authority to give justification to be in a surgery suite. They have the ability to control and manage it. So who's in charge of it? We have people. So a lot of times we want to manage people. Even if I think in terms of what happens in a fire, how do I know who's in a building? And so a college presents kind of that worst case scenario. If there were a building fire in this very building we're in today, do we know how many people are in this building right now? No. So this would be very tough to identify who's in a building. In many companies, they're very controlled. You have to check in with the receptionist. They keep track of who's there. And in case of a fire, they have a very detailed checkout process to make sure that they have enough people. Correct. And that's true at most campuses. That's true at a lot of companies. If I think about most, county courthouse, how do we know who's going to be in there? So it's helpful and it's very useful if we can control everybody, but a lot of times we have zones. So there are zoned areas. So hospitals have employee-only areas. Then if you go to medical records, a lot of times they're behind another locked door, or IT departments, or if we look at our college campus, there's areas that we're not allowed to just walk into, I hope. Student records, there's areas that are locked off, financial records. So we try to track people. And so sometimes we might have what skills they have, what their level is. So HR records, if you want to think about it in this term. And these records, though, should include, though, also people that are on, visitors and those kinds of things, so that we know that they're routed appropriately. if I think of an organization like Cooper Nuclear, where you have a nuclear plant, there's different levels of clearance and different people can go to different areas, and oftentimes there's off-site people there. And so a sticky note badge is probably not appropriate to manage them. And I say that because I got a tour out at Cooper, and that's what they gave me at one point. Of literally a sticky note with my name on it. And then I just kind of wandered around for a while. It was kind of frightening in a way. There were some cool things, but it was a little frightening that would you let me walk around? Yeah, they did ask about cameras and those kinds of things, but it was very an odd procedure. So when we look at those assets, we also want to look at what their purpose is. So do we want to protect a computer from 1999 with Windows 2000 on it with the same level of vigor, or do you want a new information source resource? And probably not. So all this information we can store. So when we talk about data, we have the same thing. We look at that data, how it's used, how is it stored, what its backup procedure is, and hopefully there is a backup procedure. And so again, when we do this process, you may find that you have, well, I thought the IT department was backing up this data. The human records resources people may go, well, I thought we were backing it up, and you end up with these, and you end up finding out that a lot of times things you thought were backed up isn't. You may have redundancies in backup that you can eliminate. You may have data that you don't need anymore that's sitting around stagnant and stale that you can move off-site to store. Who owns that data? Who can access it? How do we restore it in the case that something does go wrong? So this asset management is really a fairly comprehensive process, and most companies have already gotten into some of this, but now we're looking at it with that risk management piece in there. How do I manage that risk of a resource? So we may have a classification scheme, and so when they built our student information system, they built giant matrices of who can access what information, which one's public, which one's internal. And so as a student, you get to make some decisions about what information of yours is shared and what isn't. And as student athletes, sometimes you make different choices. And it can come all the way down to some students don't even want their name revealed if they're on the honor roll. So there's different levels of that, how we do that. And then we look at this value. How do we value our assets? So monetarily, obviously, but we also need to rank them in terms of priorities. Which ones do we need to safeguard more than others? And so certainly I would hope people is ranked high on there. So if we look at things like a fire, I'm hoping that we look at get everybody out of the building before we worry about grabbing the file out of my desk. As I say that, I still chuckle, and I hope we've done much better. We had a fire drill many, many years ago, and the fire alarms went off, and most of us evacuated our classrooms because we knew something about it. We get outside, and it became pretty obvious that we were missing a group of people from our fire drill. Anybody want to take a guess what group of people in our building we forgot? Daycare. So maybe we should get the daycare students out of the fiery building. So, but it was a training and a learning experience. They thought, nobody had ever contacted them to tell them that it's going to be a live drill. We're going to move people outside. And so if you have flashbacks to those drills in kindergarten and grade school and high school, well, they're there for a purpose. And so sometimes we notice that, hey, we missed these things. So relative value, relative assessment. And again, these things can change as our data ages. So what is the most critical to our organization to keep it running, to keep it successful? Which one generates the most revenue? And if we have a lot of those generating revenue, which one generates the most profitability? And so from a lot of your business classes, there's a difference between revenue and profitability. So if I'm making $1 million, but I've spent $10 million to make it, that's a lot different than if I made $1 million and I spent $100,000 to make that. So in other words, that profitability. Which ones are the most expensive to replace? Which ones are able to be replaced? And so sometimes if we have some older equipment or non-standard hardware, so some of systems may not be that effective, but if it's an older system or it's something non-standard, how do I even get equipment to replace it? And what do I do in those cases? We ran into that in a hospital I did some consulting with. They used an IBM AIX server, one machine, very robust, but the reality was if that hospital burned down, it would take 2 to 3 weeks for IBM to build and ship another machine like that for another 280,000 or whatever it was. So that became an issue. How do we deal with that in terms of time? And it became very apparent when actually a fellow hospital in the state had that system crash and had to replace parts in it. They were luckily able to get parts within a week, but their entire electronic medical record system was down for a week, which that's a long time in terms of paper and generation of data. So there's an asset classification scheme, and again, these can be different depending on your internal company. So we want to rank these things in order of importance, so you could use multiple factors. You could use those Excel skills to put together a ranking system very similar to this, but tailored to your own company, and be able to sort by what items are most important to us. And when we do that, don't forget that we need to make sure that the information stored on your boss's computer probably is more important than all of the minions in the office, or not. So if we thought every threat was going to attack every system, so some of the things that I start in this class, it starts to lead to paranoia, but the reality is not every threat's going to attack every system and every issue. Now, do we want to just go out and add internet access to every computer and every device, take away firewalls, and just allow unfettered access by employees to anything on the internet? No. But we do have to find some way to narrow it. We can't spend $6 million in information security for a company that generates $150,000 in revenue. So we look at these and we have to make a best guess. And sometimes we're going to guess wrong. And we have to know how to react to that then and change policies, procedures, people when that happens. So we look at what threat is a danger currently, which ones are the worst threats currently, and that's going to change. This is a dynamic process. As we wander around and we change and the world revolves around us, we know that people from the inside are one of the biggest threats and are going to remain one of the biggest threats. And I don't know how to solve that entirely. Training's great. We're still going to occasionally have an issue. So maybe intellectual property is our biggest issue. So the one that always comes to mind is Kentucky Fried Chicken and their secret recipe. Do you think it's really that secret at this point? Maybe, maybe not. What about the recipe for Coke and Pepsi and those kinds of things? Well, they're certainly shared with all these distributors, but it's that intellectual property. And in fact, companies now are worth more for their intellectual property than they are for physical assets. So look at Facebook. Does Facebook own a lot of physical assets? They probably own some now. Do they own more physical assets than General Motors? But yet, if I look in valuation, which company is valued higher? So if I take every stock that's outstanding, the bailout is probably a whole different issue. But okay, let's pick Ford. Which is valued more, Ford or Google? Which has more physical resources and employees? Well, I can tell you that it's Google has valued at a far higher valuation, but they have less employees. They have less physical assets. They're based solely on that idea of intellectual property. So human error or failure is certainly an issue. Technological obsolescence, and we run into that every day. Right now, because what's happening in 7 days from now? So when Windows XP supports You got to go out there. So things like, how do we deal with that? How many thousands of ATMs are running on Windows XP? How many desktops in companies? Because Windows 7, a lot of companies ran it. Are people jumping on board with Windows 8? Not if they can avoid it in a lot of cases. So there's still 30 to 40% of the desktop business market as Windows XP. And a lot of them are pretty critical systems. So how do I fix that? And is that an issue? If you know that at the hospital you go to, all of your healthcare information is stored on a Windows XP machine that's going to have vulnerabilities, does that scare you? Not only does it have your health information, it's got all your social security number, financial information. It probably should. So we also have theft and technical hardware failure, software. All of these are concerns, and we need to think about how we're going to deal with them in terms of risk. So, a couple of things that I find interesting. So, while we have these very large incidents like Target, the actual number of attacks seems to be decreasing because the attackers, I think, are getting more sophisticated. Why bother and attack you as an individual when I can attack a company? And that may be. But on the other hand, that use of malware on individual computers seems to be going up. The other issue is companies are starting to figure out, if I don't have to report anything, maybe I shouldn't. Because I don't want to appear to be vulnerable, I don't want to impact my stock price. And so some of those numbers we have to work with a little bit of blurry. And if we're pulling only our numbers from research sponsored by antivirus companies, is that going to be a little suspect? There's a survey, and a lot of companies have put those out. We have CIO and Baseline, a lot of different magazines. Companies and how they perceive threats, it's an interesting model. Because until a company gets hit, they usually think they're very, very secure, and they think they're doing everything they can. And if I weigh that against what they spend, because one of the bad things, if a company doesn't get attacked, and I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it's sometimes a good thing for spending in terms of security. But if we're very successful in our information security efforts, what happens? The CIO and the CEO don't know that we may get attacked 37 times and it's all been sorted. So we say, well, we can get rid of these people very quickly, make them go away. So making sure of what's happening and where we're at in terms of awareness becomes very, very important. Once we know what we have for assets that we need to secure, then we can start looking at vulnerabilities. So we have our list of assets, then we can start creating a matrix of what's vulnerable on those assets. We try to get diverse groups so you get a brainstorming effect. You don't have just one person's idea. So this is a vulnerability assessment of a router. So we look at all those same ideas. So intellectual property, software attacks, theft, and then we look at how that affects that particular item. And so it takes a while to go through that. And we want to get groups of people because sometimes we get focused in on what we know and we don't think about what could happen. So if we're a software guy, we're thinking software, we're not thinking about somebody walking in and just unplugging it and walking out the door with it. And that's actually been a method that several companies have lost property, intellectual property, is by people coming in doing a bit of a social engineering attack. They show up in a van that looks like a big moving van. They come in with carts and and they have the proper, it looks like paperwork, and they have literally carted off an entire server closet or a server room and taken it with them. And so the loss isn't really that the servers are expensive to replace, it's that loss of data and that loss of privacy. So even though we think sometimes we're in the right area, and so I'm going to leave you with a little tale of a small medical practice that I got to. Nope, it was not in Auburn. It was not in Fall City, so neither of those. But I went in to look at, and they were wanting to know some questions. What can we do a little better? So we kind of did a real quick technology audit for them, essentially. And so I walked in the door, and they said, well, we do a backup of our system. And it wasn't very complicated at this point, but it was their billing and it had some rudimentary medical information. And they said, well, we do a backup, and our office manager takes a disk, they burn a disk, and takes it, and they take it somewhere. So I asked the office manager, he goes, well, yeah, usually I go out and I just put them in my car and store them there. So this at first panicked me, thinking, well, here's critical information, and you're putting it in a car. And that scared me for two reasons. One, somebody could just grab that CD and possibly have all the information. And two, what happens to a CD in a hot car? Kind of melty. So does this seem like a really good way to store our information? So I put that down and kind of had the momentary panic of, holy cow, these people don't have a clue. I went into what they called their room with the server. So it's really the office manager's office, and it's got the server sitting there. And I'm looking around and kind of, there's a lot of strange issues. It's not locked. And then I looked at this server. So I asked the question, now you burn a disk, right? Because I'm looking at this server, and they happen to have it up on the desk, so I'm staring at eye level where this disk drive said CD-ROM. Now CD-ROM means CD read only. They didn't actually own a DVD or CD burner in that server. Now the software they were using wasn't smart enough to know that. It sent it to thinking that it was creating a disk, and so they would think they burned a disk, and they were really just recycling empty disks for years and had no backup at all. They were a little astounded, but again, it's not something that they do, and you would have thought that this software would have recognized, hey, that's not really burning, it's not doing anything, but it was very unsophisticated. So what we ended up doing is moving them to a cloud-based backup system, fairly inexpensive. I think they're spending about $25 a month for the amount of data. It's encrypted between the two locations. It's probably maybe not the best method, but it's one method. One issue is how do we get the data back? It takes a long time to retrieve that data, and it takes a long time to actually move the data there. So it takes a lot of backups. But once the first backup was done, you only change those things that are different between the two. So we will look on Thursday at this TVA assessment worksheet, and we'll add a few other pieces. So make sure you've looked at, there's 2 discussion board assignments this week. There is one that looks at digital forensics, so I'm looking at a current event in digital forensics, or as currently we can find. The other one, I like Cyber Siege, but a lot of students had issues going through it, and the help files are less than helpful in some cases. The videos show some information. So your assignment for this week is you're going to create 5 helpful hints, detailed hints, for 5 different scenarios within Cyber Siege. So you're going to have to revisit it a little bit, and you're going to create a list of hints. Now, by hint, I don't mean tell them exactly how to solve the objective, but give them an assistance, what you would have found useful to kind of guide you, because there's a lot of information in there. So don't solve the problem, and then we're going to create create that into a wiki then for the next class we'll have as a helpful hint solution on top of the videos. Now my hope is, and I've sent several emails and I've heard back, that they're going to make this a web-based or simulation at some point. Because the graphics are certainly capable now of online usage. It's not that sophisticated. And in fact, in theory, we'll play off of a CD directly now, or a DVD. But, so we can get around some of the issues with Macs and computers and other issues. So it becomes a Web 2.0, if you want to think of it, tool. All right, go out and enjoy April Fool's Day. I was going to make something up. That's interesting there, doesn't it? So, all right. I would create some kind of April Fool's joke, but I already had one pulled on me by my girlfriend this morning. So all right.